Mad Panic Gaming.
Awesome!
Hey everybody, Jim here and welcome to 16-Bit Anime, a series where I take a look at 16-bit games based on some of the most popular anime of the 90s, and we're kicking things off with what I and many people think is the best Dragon Ball Z game of the entire decade, and that is Hyper Dimension on the Super Famicom, which was released late into the console's lifespan in 1996. And it takes all of the good things from previous 16-bit DBZ games and drops some of their more annoying aspects, which makes sense as most of the staff that worked on this game had also worked on the very popular Super Butoden series. Also, this game now has an English patch, making it more accessible than it's ever been. Hyper Dimension features 10 playable characters, and it's a fairly traditional one-on-one fighter, but since it's DBZ, it features some very cool earth-shattering super moves, and it definitely plays a lot faster and feels more intuitive than previous DBZ fighters. Battles can take place both on the ground and in the air, and you can transition between both and even between stages in a single match, which is pretty cool. This game also removes the beam struggles from the Butoden series, which I think was a good choice, and honestly this is a lot closer to Street Fighter than any other game based on the series, albeit Street Fighter on steroids. There aren't a ton of gameplay modes, but the gameplay itself is solid enough that it's not such a big deal. The roster is also admittedly small, but all of the heavy hitters are here, and they each have a huge arsenal of special and super attacks. Something else unique to this game is that instead of just a health bar, you have a health number that you can actually slowly increase by powering up, and your health bar doesn't start depleting until the number hits 150. So matches can be quite drawn out, and they can get very competitive. Overall, a fun and well-made fighter with some outstanding graphics. The visuals had a darker and more detailed look to them than previous games did, and I really like it. The soundtrack is just okay, honestly. The music is decent, but definitely nothing memorable, but the sound effects and voice samples sound pretty damn good. The Super Butoden games were great for their time and can still be a good bit of quick fun today, but if you can only play one 16-bit DBZ game, definitely make it Hyper Dimension. It looks and plays better than all of the games that came before it, and honestly, a lot of the games that came after it too. Next, let's move away from DBZ and on to something a bit prettier, with Bishoujo Senshi Sailor Moon on the Sega Mega Drive. And what do you do with an anime series about a bunch of teenage girls battling the forces of evil with love and feminine charms? Why, you turn it into a good old-fashioned beat-em-up, of course. And I wish I could say this was one of the best, but Streets of Rage, it certainly is not. Honestly, that makes sense though, as I imagine the target audience for this game at the time might not have been up to the task of a brutally difficult beat-em-up, so this one is, by comparison, very easy. It's a nice leisurely playthrough, and it does feature all 5 of the Sailor Scouts as playable characters. And it's not just for show. They each have different standard and special attacks, as well as different projectiles that can be fired by simply charging the attack button for a couple of seconds. They also each have a super attack that sacrifices a little bit of health, as is typical of these kinds of games. Really though, this is a very straightforward and kind of slow-paced beat-em-up, and this is an instance where you would actually rather play the Super Famicom game, as this version is unfortunately single player only, which is mind-boggling to me. By 1994, it would have been obvious that the cornerstone of any good beat-em-up is fun co-op gameplay, but unfortunately, that's not an option here. On the other hand, this is a very good-looking game, all things considered. The character sprites are very large, and the backgrounds are varied, colorful, and detailed. Plus, you do get lots of little Sailor Moon series details like stage intros, similar to the transitions from the show, plenty of cutscenes and cameos from other characters such as Tuxedo Mask, and various recognizable villains. The sound design is just okay in my opinion, nothing to write home about, but we do at least get a pretty cool rendition of the Sailor Moon theme song. I was honestly kind of shocked when I realized that this game was an early project of Arc System Works. That's right, before they were kicking ass with Guilty Gear, they were getting pretty with the Sailor Scouts. Anyway, all things considered, this is far from being the worst 16-bit beat-em-up. It's actually pretty decent, all things considered, but the lack of multiplayer is what really holds it back. If you're a big Sailor Moon fan though, you'll definitely want to play this game at least once. If nothing else, it'll make you feel pretty. Next up, kind of hard to have an anime game discussion without bringing up Gundam, so here we have Kido Butoden G Gundam for the Super Famicom, and this is a game that's overshadowed by a much better Gundam fighting game, but we'll save that one for another episode. It's odd though, considering that this is the only Gundam series to my knowledge ever made where the plot centers around an international mech fighting tournament and features Gundams from all over the world that each have their own unique fighting style. So you'd think this would be perfect for a fighting game. And yeah, it's a perfect premise for a fighting game, but the execution leaves something to be desired. This controls like a fairly standard 2D fighting game, complete with the special move commands that you'd expect, and even some devastating super attacks. But in general, the controls are pretty stiff, and the gameplay is kind of clunky and slow. It's not a total mess, mind you, I've played much worse 16-bit fighting games, but it just has that feel, you know? Not every developer at the time could get the mechanics of a good fighting game right, and that's unfortunately the case here. It's still a playable game, but you'd much rather be playing Super Street Fighter 2, Killer Instinct, or that other Super Famicom Gundam fighter, Endless Duel. In terms of graphics and sound, that's another area where G Gundam is just okay. A bunch of mechs from the series are here, and they look the way they're supposed to, and the various stages also look fine. They're just lacking something in the way of detail, I guess. The music is similarly underwhelming. It's not awful, but it lacks a certain fullness, if that makes any sense. Again, I can't help but refer back to Endless Duel, which admittedly was released a couple of years after this game, but the graphics and sound are like night and day. I'm not saying I expected G Gundam to look and sound exactly like that, but it is a stark contrast. Honestly, I can really only recommend this game to big-time Gundam fans who have to play anything with the series name attached to it, but for everyone else, if you want to play a good Gundam fighting game on the Super Famicom, Endless Duel is really all you need. G Gundam is a passable effort, but it was made obsolete once Natsume stepped up to the plate. And now for something completely different. We've had two fighting games and a beat-em-up, so let's take a look at a it's hard to describe kind of game with Yu Yu Hakusho on the Super Famicom. This is the first of 4 games on the console based on one of my personal all-time favorite anime series, and it covers the start of the story all the way through the Dark Tournament, and the gameplay is something totally unique, at least to my knowledge. This is still technically a one-on-one fighting game, but instead of your traditional fighting gameplay, goes for sort of a weird strategy fighting gameplay style. It goes like this. Each round, both players choose an action for their character to perform, and see how things play out. Kind of like an advanced game of rock, paper, scissors. You can opt for a physical attack, which won't use up any spirit energy, but won't deal as much damage and is easier to dodge. Or you can launch an energy attack and potentially deal some big damage, but with less spirit energy over time, you become more vulnerable. You can, of course, charge your spirit energy back up, but again, that makes you a sitting duck. It's definitely an odd gameplay style, and one I don't recall seeing in any other games, but once you get the hang of it, this game becomes pretty fun. There's a story mode to play through that hits most of the major battles from the show, and there's a versus mode as well. The roster features lots of characters from the anime, and they all have their signature attacks, and something especially cool about this game is the visuals. Yu Yu Hakusho goes for a very cinematic look, which again is quite unique, and whenever the characters are performing their special attacks, we're treated to some kick-ass Mode 7 graphics. Very cool stuff, and a great looking game all around. The sound design is decent too, though I was particularly impressed by the quality of the voice samples, and there are a lot of them. Every time a character launches a special attack in keeping with the anime tradition, they scream the name of the attack and the voices come through surprisingly clear. This honestly isn't going to be a game for everyone. I'm sure a lot of people would much prefer to play just a good old-fashioned 2D fighter, in which case, there are a few that are based on Yu Yu Hakusho. But if you're looking for something a little out of the ordinary that actually does a pretty good job of recreating a fight scene from the show, this is a game that I can definitely recommend. For the last game we're looking at today, we've got something at least a little more obscure. When it comes to DBZ, Sailor Moon, Gundam, and Yu Yu Hakusho, you've got a lot of options for your 16-bit fix. But when it comes to magical Taruruuto-kun, you really only have a few, and just one game on the Sega Mega Drive, and that's this game right here, which was published by Sega in 1992, and it was actually developed by Game Freak, the same Game Freak behind the Pokemon series. So just like with Sailor Moon, we get to see an interesting early work from a developer that went on to do much bigger and better things. This was yet another Japan exclusive release, which makes sense as, to the best of my knowledge, Magical Taruruuto-kun is a series that itself has never really seen any success outside of Japan. This particular game is, as is the case with most games based on the series now that I think of it, is a fairly straightforward platformer, and to date it's also the best game I've ever played based on this series. You get one main attack in this game, which is hitting things with Taruruuto-kun's magic wand, and when you hit objects with it, you can pick them up, which also gives them eyes for some strange reason, and you can then launch them as a projectile. You also have a double jump that turns into a glide if you hold the jump button, and this is eventually an indispensable ability as you'll need to clear some big gaps and slide under some obstacles at the end of your glide. This is a fun enough game with responsive controls, quality work by Game Freak, and the visuals are excellent. This is a very bright and colorful game filled with large character sprites and lots of cool little effects here and there, and the soundtrack is super upbeat and chipper to match the visuals. The one major drawback to this game though is that it is very easy. Not much challenge to it at all really, whether it be the stages themselves or the boss battles. This is a very leisurely and stress-free playthrough. Again, I'm guessing the target audience was a bit younger, but still a slight bump up in challenge would have been appreciated. Overall though, not a bad game at all, and well worth playing if you're a fan of platformers. Just be prepared to finish this one in about 45 minutes or so. A short game and not a particularly tough one, but enjoyable nonetheless. And that'll do it for this edition of 16-Bit Anime. Thanks for watching, and let me know down in the comments, what are some of your favorite 16-bit games based on anime? I'd love to hear from you. And as always, until next time, stay awesome everyone. Goodbye.